Oh, howdy all, grab yourself a drink. It is time for some PathOfExile discussion. Welcome to discussion of 3.25 Settlers of Kalguur. Today, one of the things that came out that I wanted to put a separate video out on is the new and changed gems information. This is going to be really important for building your characters, and it's something that's only been out a couple of hours. So let's have a quick brainstorm through them. There's a number of gems here that are much better than I was expecting. Let's talk about some of these, starting out with Autoexertion. So Autoexertion does what we heard it was going to do. It's basically the new version of the Warcry's automatically repeat support gem, and it has the text that's worried a few people. This skill's mana reservation is equal to the total of mana reservations of supported skills and cannot be further modified. The reason that this text is here is to prevent it double dipping on mana reservation efficiency. So what's going to happen is that you will then turn on each individual one of the auto-exerted Warcries, and then their mana reservation is going to be added up together, and that's going to be the total reservation cost of Autoexertion. Each individual Warcry will have 15% mana reservation, and that will be modified by your mana reservation efficiency. So if your mana reservation efficiency is 50%, then that's going to come down to 10% per Warcry. That's all going to get added together, and let's say you've got 3 of them, that's going to be 30%. Then Autoexertion's reservation is going to be 30%. It's not going to double dip on your 50% reservation efficiency down to 20%, it's just going to be 30%. That's what that otherwise fairly worrying looking line of text means. So Autoexertion does exactly what we thought it was going to do. This is going to be pretty widely used on builds that want to focus on slams, but it's also not going to be completely universal, as it does have a very serious drawback. All you really get from supported Warcries is their capacity to exert attacks. You do not get any of the other abilities they might have, such as the endurance charges and the life recovery that you would have got from Enduring Cry. Is this worth it? For some Warcries the answer is clearly no, for some Warcries the answer is definitely yes, and for most of them it's somewhere in the middle. Very important to note, if you're thinking of using this, at least be aware of the Uber Shaper helmet, Echoes of Creation. This item is the most common drop from Uber Shaper in 3.24. It seems to have a drop rate of 50%. So with that in mind, this is something that you can count on getting if you're playing in Softcore Trade Enabled, definitely. And even if you're playing in Solo Self-Found, if you're familiar with the Uber Shaper fight, it's something you can aspire to getting because it's not particularly RNG gated. That's one to keep in mind if you're thinking of using this. There's definitely a lot of synergy between the two. You definitely want a 15% roll on this if you're going to be using it in conjunction with Auto Exert. That is 15% on the second roll, because it's going to make a huge difference. Also, Echoes of Creation does some backlash damage to you, but this is something that you can easily mitigate through armor. You won't completely get it down to nothing, but it won't be anything that completely ruins your day. The next thing we've got to talk about is Crushing Fist, and this thing hits hard. So this deals 2,193.8% of base attack damage, but has 60% less damage with ailments. Even with that said though, this is still going to do a lot of damage with ailments. This is going to be 880% of base damage with ailments, which I think is more than sufficient for it to be a reasonable delivery mechanism for both Ignite and Bleed. Poison, less so, because Poison's strength is your ability to stack lots of them, and Crushing Fist is not going to play well to that because it's a Retaliation skill. One thing I want to say about Retaliation skills, when I was discussing the Gladiator in an earlier video, which I'll link at the end of this one, I was very negative on the node that specializes in Retaliation skills. It lets you invest hard in them in order to get a huge benefit for each Retaliation skill you use. That turns out not to be well founded because the numbers on these are crazy high, and I think that we'll see very widespread use of these Retaliation skills. It is definitely worth your while considering fitting Versatile Combatant onto a build, capping your attack and spell block to the Versatile Combatant limit if you can, and once you do that, finding some Retaliation skill that you can socket into your build. It's not going to work on everything, but if it does play well to the build that you're playing, then there's definitely a lot of power in that setup. Now the Retaliation skills mostly trigger when you block, and Crushing Fist is one of these. So let's go through what it says. Retaliate against a blocked hit by calling forth a huge armored fist to slam into the ground in front of you as you do the same, dealing weapon damage in an area. I did want to point out a slight ambiguity here. It's not 100% clear from the wording on Crushing Fist whether or not this can be used unarmed. I think it can be, but there are some precedents for skills that can be used unarmed, not using the term dealing weapon damage, but instead using the term dealing damage. For the moment, I'm going to assume it can be used unarmed, but everything that I'm going to say about Doriani's Fist will end up not applying if it turns out that Crushing Fist cannot, in fact, be used unarmed. That's going to be something I assume that Grinding Gear Games will clarify closer to the time of the league launching. The reason that I mention this is the best thing thematically to use with Crushing Fist is Doriani's Fist. They're tier 2 rarity drop anywhere unique, at least they were in 3.23 the last time they were checked, And so that means that they're pretty rare. They're definitely not something that you can expect to find yourself quickly in a league, but they will be available in trade. And these do a staggering amount of additional lightning damage to your unarmed melee hits. This could be really interesting because it also grants you Doriani's Touch, the skill Dominus uses, the infamous Touch of God attack. Doriani's Fist is going to be a lot of fun to use alongside Crushing Fist, assuming it works. I think it does work, but I'm definitely not going to promise that it does until we get clarification on whether the weapon damage here does work with unarmed. Now let's talk about Eviscerate. This is the best of the new skills, the Retaliation skills. This thing is a bit clunky in terms of its aiming, but oh my god, the damage on this is crazy. 1,345.1% of baseline damage. This causes bleeding and it has no nerfs to ailment damage. That means that if you want to be a hipster, you can definitely ignite with this. Rebuke of the Vaal is your friend. It's definitely intended to be used in conjunction with a bleed playstyle, and it has a lot of synergies with that. So this is going to hit for a staggeringly hard bleed, and it's also going to do so twice on enemies that are reasonably close to you. There are a couple of reasons that hitting twice is a really good thing. The first one is that for builds that are focused on instant application damage, whether that be critical strike or non-crit, and this also applies to poison damage, hitting twice is just twice as much damage. The second thing though, is that even for DOT builds, you don't get quite as much as an instant application damage build gets, but you still do get quite a bit here. You can fish for a larger initial hit, and that larger initial hit can then scale up the damage you're getting further. The amount that this is going to benefit you will depend upon the difference between the minimum and maximum damage on your weapon. If you're willing to use Rizlatha's Coil and or Volatility support, you can make that gap even wider, and that's going to make this even better to get that 2 hits. The third benefit that you get from it only applies to bleed, and only applies if you don't have Jagged Technique automatically aggravating all of your bleeds. That's one of the nodes in the Gladiator Ascendancy. If you're in this situation, then Eviscerate's hitting twice may allow you to proc some of the percentage chances to aggravate existing bleeds on a target enemy. So in this scenario, your first hit applies a bleed, and then your second hit, especially if it's a critical strike, it may proc one of these aggravate existing bleeds on a target. That will be more damage when it goes off. This is probabilistic, it's not deterministic, but it could still be very, very good, and it's something to consider, especially if you are going critical strike and bleed at the same time, which of course there's a lot of support for in this patch because of the overhaul to Perfect Agony. The base wavelength is 10 meters and 3.2 meters wide, and the way that I interpret this, they're going to hit some sort of X that's close to being centered at your character. The biggest weakness of this is that it's not going to hit enemies that are 5 or 6 meters directly in front of you, and so you will need to have some form of proliferation of kills in order to deal with those. Proliferation of kills could be done through the Gladiator's bleed explosions, or it could be done through Ignite. And I definitely don't want to rule out the possibility of Eviscerate being used with evisceratingly vicious ignites with Rebuke of the Vaal. I know I said it's a bit of a meme, but it's possibly a meme with real teeth. You could also conceivably use this without any emphasis on ailments, and just use it as an instant application critical strikes or an instant application hit damage skill. And it's going to be an extra button that you can press every time that you qualify for Eviscerate in order to do a whole chunk of extra damage. So there's a lot of potential there, Eviscerate. The numbers on this are so good that I'm inclined to recommend taking it very seriously. The other big question you've got to answer is, where do you put your 6 link, where do you put your 4 link? Eviscerate is the sort of skill you might elect to have in a supplementary 4 link, and then have a 6 link for main damage, and you're going and clearing through a map, killing everything with your 6 link, but then when you get to a boss, and you actually qualify to use Eviscerate, you tap it, and it does much more damage with 1 hit than your 6 link would do. The other thing that you could conceivably do though, is have a 4 link main clear skill, and then every time that you run into a monster that's just that bit tougher, that's when you fire off a 6 link Eviscerate in order to kill them. Lots of options, and this just looks really, really solid. And next, Grungy Games decided to name a skill after the 3rd novel in a series that will probably never be finished, A Storm of Swords. And Swordstorm is something that damages enemies 8 times. This addresses my concerns about it not looking like it did very much damage. So 247.1% of base damage, damages enemies 8 times. This screams out a few things to me at the same time. Firstly, it can be used with instant application crit or instant application hit damage, but it could also conceivably be used to poison. If your build's all about poison and you can fit in a retaliation skill, which is fairly unlikely but still possible, then Swordstorm is something you would consider as your one choice of retaliation skill. Lots of options there, and keep in mind Versatile Combatant if you're going to go down any of these routes, because Versatile Combatant is getting giga buffed in patch 3.25, and it's going to be really, really strong in conjunction with any of these skills that require you to block in order to do damage to enemies. So with Versatile Combatant, I call it out specifically in conjunction with Swordstorm because Versatile Combatant provides a lot of spell block, and the fact that you're using a dual wield only retaliation skill means of course that you're dual wielding, which means that you are not able to use Tempest Shield, which is one of the single best sources in the game of spell block. This allows you an alternative way to get that spell block cap on a character that might otherwise not have it. And that's why I think that Versatile Combatant should go together really well with Swordstorm. Maybe I'm a little bit too dismissive of dual wielding as a playstyle. It's been the worst of the main combat archetypes for a while in PathOfExile, but it's definitely something that does have a few tools that can make it work. And so keep that in mind if you're interested in going dual wield with weapons. Swordstorm is there for you as an option to use. Next up we have Vengeful Cry. Now Vengeful Cry is interesting in that it has a different trigger condition to most of the other retaliation skills, and it's also a war cry. So you retaliate against a savage hit with a war cry, taunting all nearby enemies to attack you, and the person making the war cry and nearby allies gain a buff which grants rage and prevents rage from being lost. So effectively this is generally going to cap out your rage when you use it, but you need to be hit by a savage hit in order to use this. A savage hit is one that drains at least 15% of your life. Now conveniently there is a very accessible and useful way to inflict a savage hit on yourself. As long as your chaos resistance is 69% or less, Doedra's Elixir is going to chonk you for at least 15% of your life when you drink from it. It's going to give you a bunch of charges, which are very useful, and if you're not focused on bossing, this may even be your only charge sustain, and it's going to deal you that chaos damage that's going to trigger Vengeful Cry if you want to use it. Various unusual forms of chaos damage mitigation, such as the 4th Vaal chest piece, these will brick this, so don't use any of those and keep your chaos resistance 69% or lower. If you jump through the hoops to trigger Vengeful Cry though, the payoff is really substantial. Buff grants 25 to maximum rage is a really big deal, and additionally you'll gain a number of rage per second based upon the number of monsters around you, and Vengeful Cry will also turn off the inherent loss of rage. It's important to note that these are all buff related aspects, so you definitely don't want to use this in conjunction with Autoexertion. Vengeful Cry is definitely something that you will manually use, and you definitely get a large payoff for it. There may be other solutions people come up with in order to use alongside this, because Doedra's Elixir does have a lot of drawbacks. It does take up a flask slot, and it is also quite slow to refill. So keep an eye out. I'm a bit less sold on using this against natural damage that you've taken from enemies, and I'm also a bit less sold on using it in conjunction with Forbidden Rite, because Forbidden Rite, whilst it will inflict a savage hit on you if your chaos resistance is low enough, the chaos resistance threshold where that's the case is a bit lower, and as a result it's a bit less safe to be at endgame with that level of chaos resistance all the time. Lots of options though, and Vengeful Cry definitely an interesting gem that will see some use. Now we have Glacial Shield Swipe. This thing hits hard. So this retaliates against a blocked hit with a sweep of your shield, unleashing a wave of ice in a cone in front of you. This deals tremendous amounts of base physical damage, then converts all of that damage to cold. The numbers on this are incredibly high. Both the initial damage that's done, the scaling off your evasion and armor on your shield, but also the fact that it's only 50% less damage with ailments. Again, we've got that thing where this has such high numbers that even losing 50% of it, you can still do a really scary ignite with this. And honestly, that's my first thought. Get a massively chunky armor evasion shield on a character, and then use Glacial Shield Swipe on a character that's ignite spec'd, and you are going to set the world on fire. You probably need to be an elementalist to do this, or else you'll need to convert that cold damage into fire. Fortunately though, if you are looking to convert cold damage into fire on a chieftain, all you need to use is Cold to Fire support and Avatar of Fire, if that fits your build, or you could conceivably use Cold to Fire support in conjunction with the unique Ring Pyre. So there's lots of solutions here. The key thing is making sure that you're tanky enough that you can survive being hit a couple of times while you're trying to get that block. Because even if you're using Versatile Combatant and getting 65% spell block and 65% attack block, or maybe you don't even need Versatile Combatant, you're getting 75-75 without it, it is still a case that while you block the majority of attacks, you're not going to block every single attack, and the ones that come through are going to hurt. So Glacial Shield Swipe is really strong. Did I mention this always freezes enemies and cannot be evaded as well? A lot of these have cannot be evaded on them. That is a really big line of text when you've got something that is a big fire off skill. Essentially what all of these skills are so far, they're like a Vaal skill in a lot of ways. Instead of requiring a big charge up to use where you've got to kill a whole bunch of enemies and you can use them maybe 7 or 8 times per map, They instead have a different trigger condition, and that trigger condition is going to be tied to your reflexes, noticing the buff is up, and then firing it off straight away when it is up. And now we move away from retaliation skills to something that just hits really, really hard. Puncture of Shanking does 437.9% of base damage, and it has 69% more damage with bleeding. So this is going to deal more than 700% of base damage when it's used as a bleed skill, and it also has increased critical strike chance against bleeding enemies. This is the game screaming at you. I have designed this entire skill around a critical strike bleed melee playstyle. Please use me with Perfect Agony. Please use me with Perfect Agony. If you can get your critical strike chance on Puncture of Shanking up to 100%, then this is going to have a tremendous, tremendous payoff. Also, Puncture of Shanking provides you with a 100% chance to inflict bleed as well, so it solves any need to invest in any chance to bleed on your character. Know what else causes bleeding automatically and therefore solves any need to invest in inflicting bleed on your character? That's right, Eviscerate. These two could well be best friends forever. You use Puncture of Shanking alongside a fizz-rolled claw, dagger, or sword, and then you'll use Eviscerate every time that it's available because Eviscerate is going to be really strong. Puncture of Shanking also has a strike tag, which means that whilst early in the game it's only going to be striking one target, later in the game you're going to be able to make it strike multiple targets, especially if you can get exquisite or perfect tier Searing Exarch implicit gloves that provide you with +2 additional strike targets. The one drawback to this skill, 70% of base attack speed. This is going to be a slow, super hard hitting skill, and that's not a playstyle that's for everyone, and it may not be a playstyle for you. So do keep that in mind. There is definitely a drawback here. There is power, but there is also pain. Next we have Divine Retribution. When I saw this skill, my first thought was I need to compare this to Wave of Conviction because they're both physical damage that's partially converted to lightning. Granted, Wave of Conviction also partially converts to fire. They're different skills, but they're very similar in a lot of ways. Divine Retribution at gem level 20 does 390% base damage compared to Wave of Conviction's 330%. So Divine Retribution is 18% more damage per hit. Divine Retribution also is going to hit multiple times. Each wave has 6 bursts and it causes 4 waves. People are reading this in different ways, but for the purposes of assessing this skill, I'm going to assume that it hits 4 times on enemies. A lot of players got immediately excited about the prospect of using this as an ignite skill, and I want to pour some cold water on that fire firstly. So you're dealing 18% more base damage than Wave of Conviction does, and under our assumption, you're hitting those targets 4 times each, which means that you've got quite a bit of good luck in how big your ignite is based upon, whereas with Wave of Conviction, you're probably only hitting them once. Well, I've run the numbers on this, and the average damage on a skill that does 80 to 120% of base damage, which is the case of both Divine Retribution and Wave of Conviction, or at least they're very close to that number. The average you're going to deal with 1 hit is 100% of base damage. The average you're going to deal with 4 hits is 112% of base damage. So that's another 12% boost to Divine Retribution. So you've got 18% more damage in one place, 12% more damage in another. Multiply that together, you're looking at 32% more damage on Divine Retribution than you'd get on Wave of Conviction. How does this actually compare though? Well, Wave of Conviction has a lot of things going for it. It already inflicts exposure, which is really big if you're playing on an Ignite Elementalist in particular. Divine Retribution can get that, but it has to invest in order to do so. Wave of Conviction only converts 25% to Lightning, Divine Retribution converts 50%. That means there's going to be more investment to convert Divine Retribution into majority fire than would be necessary to do the same thing on Wave of Conviction. But probably the most significant thing, I am just not willing to jump through these hoops of setting off a Retaliation skill for 32% more damage, especially not on the Elementalist, which is now one of the squishiest classes in the game since the reduction in the availability of fizz damage taken as X modifiers. For that reason, I want to pour some cold water on the idea of an Ignite Elementalist Divine Retribution build. Where I do think this has a bit more potential though, this does hit multiple times, and that means that it's got a lot more potential in 2 situations, either instant application critical strike damage, or in conjunction with poison. Now for poison versions of this, you're pretty much going to need Original Sin, which is one of the most expensive items in all of PathOfExile, and Original Sin can make pretty much anything work. So I'm going to say that that is something for only people who can afford to invest multiple mirrors in builds, but instant application critical strike on this I think has a lot of potential, particularly given that you'd be playing this most likely on an Inquisitor, and the Inquisitor can definitely block cap with or without the use of Versatile Combatant. It's in one of the best areas of the passive tree for scaling block on your character. So next we have Expert Retaliation Support. This has 2 lines of text on it. The first one, supported retaliation skills become usable for 39% longer. This is meaningful, but I don't think it's a huge boost. This is something you'll definitely take, but you're not ecstatic about it. The main thing on this is that the supported skills have 88% more cooldown recovery rate. It's important to remember what cooldown recovery rate means. 1 second of real world time counts as 1.88 seconds for the purposes of ticking down the cooldown. In short, this is 47% less cooldown time on all of these skills. The thing is that whilst this can sound like you get to use these retaliation skills that are really powerful 88% more often, I'm actually not sold that that's going to be the way it's going to feel in practice, because you still need to wait for a triggering event. You still need to wait for a blocked hit, and as a result, I do think this will be used, but I don't think it's going to be universal on retaliation skills. I'm certainly not going to complain about that. That's exactly where support gems should be. There's something that you opt into using rather than something you use because they're numerically superior to the alternative. However, the real test for this is going to be once people do some serious analysis of recorded videos of gameplay footage. Just how many times do you get to use your retaliation skills on a similar character with and without expert retaliation support? This is going to be something that'll have to be counted over potentially dozens or even hundreds of maps. And once we've got that sort of analysis done, then we'll be able to say for certain whether or not this is something you should fit into your build. My initial thoughts though, if you're igniting or bleeding with your retaliation skills, definitely don't use this. If you're dealing instant application damage or poison damage with them, then at least consider this, but I'm not sold that you necessarily want to go that route either. Sometimes I think the best way to use these skills is going to be to find 2 different retaliation skills that work on your build and put them into a shared 4 link or a shared 6 link so that each one of them is either 3 or 5 linked, and bypass expert retaliation entirely. That way you're more likely to have a single retaliation skill up at a time, and when the situation calls for it, you can fire both off at once. That's not going to work for everyone, and there will be people for whom expert retaliation is worth using, but I don't think the numbers on this are staggeringly good or anything, and so my first thoughts on this are a little bit more negative than they are for some of the others. Next, we have more duration support. This is a rework of the existing increased duration support. Essentially, if you are investing in duration elsewhere, then this is going to be superior to the old increased duration support. If you are not investing in increased duration on your passive tree, then this is going to be inferior to the old increased duration support. It's really as simple as that. The main situation where this is worse than the increased duration support used to be is when it's used on a guard skill and you've got no investment in duration on your character at all. In that situation, you would rather have the old version of increased duration support, but that's not going to be available anymore, and you'll have to decide whether or not to make do with more duration or whether you just want to free that slot up. And next we have Overexertion support. This is the thing that is going to make slam-based builds viable in the new league. This thing does so much damage. Supported attack skills deal 18% more damage for each Warcry exerting them, plus a bonus binary 10%, that's 10% for 1+ exertions, 0% otherwise. And then of course you've got this quality bonus, supported attacks deal 20% increased damage if exerted. It's definitely the case that a lot of builds are going to be using Autoexertion, linked to 3 different Warcries, and then they're going to use Overexertion support in order to get a huge chunk of extra damage there. And maybe you'll even see people going further than using 3 Warcries with Autoexertion and just trying to use everything that can be exerted in order to juice up Overexertion support as much as possible. Once more, I want to remind you that Echoes of Creation exists and that it is really, really good. Now, one thing that Grinding Your Games have clarified on this, the first time I recorded this video, I was talking about how sad I was that Vaal Ground Slam is not going to work with Overexertion support. However, Grinding Your Games have since clarified that Vaal Ground Slam is going to get a change, not yet reflected in the patch notes, that is going to clarify that it can indeed be supported by Overexertion. So you can live the dream of a Ground Slam character that is using Vaal Ground Slam with all of these crazy Warcries that are overexerted as well, and that's something that looks pretty tempting as an option for 3.25. The final gem we need to discuss here is Rupture. This is the spiritual successor to the Rupturing Ascendancy option on the Deadeye, but it is not the same thing, and it is something that is there to empower critical strike based bleed builds. This will cause your bleeds to be much more powerful, but also to burn out faster. Remember, the star that burns twice as bright burns out 4 times as quickly. So, Rupture support is interesting in that it has the critical tag, and that may be important with a critical mastery that grants +3 to the level of support gems that have the critical tag. Depends upon the exact way that this gem scales with gem levels, but just keep that one in mind. So, supported skills have 20% increased critical strike chance. If I was to wager, I would guess that this is going to be the quality bonus. Critical strikes with supported skills that inflict bleeding also inflict Rupture. Now in 3.24, Rupture is only able to stack 3 times, but there's no text indicating that it can only stack 3 times on the new gem, and that's something that I would really like to see a clarification of. Targets take 29% more damage from bleeding per rupture on them from supported skills, but bleeding expires 25% more quickly per rupture from supported skills on target. Now when it says expires more quickly, this means that 1 second of real world time, if you have 3 stacks of rupture, drains 1.75 seconds of the bleed duration. It does not mean that a 4-second bleed falls to 3, then 2, then 1 second's duration. Instead, that 4-second bleed would fall to 3.2 seconds with 1 stack of rupture, 2.667 seconds with 2 stacks of rupture, and 2.28 seconds with 3 stacks of rupture, or 2 seconds flat if you can get 4, but we don't know whether you can get 4 or not. So the real question is rupture still capped at 3? I can't assess this gem without knowing that. If it is capped at 3, then this is strong. If it is not capped at 3, then this is going to be a phenomenal gem indeed, and it's going to work incredibly well in conjunction with Puncture of Shanking. Puncture of Shanking has some interesting text on it. Bleeding debuff will be affected by modifiers to skill duration. So if you were to invest in increased skill duration on the passive tree, there's quite a lot of ways that you can do that. You could get some really, really long bleeds, and then you can weaponize this long bleed duration through the use of Rupture Support, where you burn out this long bleed duration in order to get more damage more quickly. Now, I will say you don't want Sadism Support on this setup. Sadism Support, the drawback is simply too big. This is the one that causes 80% less duration of ailments inflicted with supported skills in exchange for them dealing damage faster. Sadism's drawback is simply too big for me to recommend it. If that drawback were changed to 40%, then yes, I would advocate using Sadism Support in this setup. But as it is, no, don't use Sadism Support. Just go with Rupture Support, Puncture of Shanking, and everything else is going to be bleed based. I think you could probably hit bleed.cap easier on this setup than anything else in the game, but of course you are then using Puncture of Shanking, which is a strike skill and so is not going to have very good damage projection. It's up to you whether that's worthwhile or not, but I do think it will be quite a good bosser, and especially good in Maven 4-way invitations as well. Anyways, that is the new gems, so there's a whole lot to discuss there, a whole lot for your own build theory crafting. I am now torn. Originally, I was wanting to play some sort of Ground Slam Chieftain, Vaal Ground Slam Chieftain. I'm now going back and forth. Maybe I just join the Gladiator herds because Eviscerate just looks so good. The numbers on this are so inspiring that I really want to play around with it. I'm still absolutely undecided, but that's what the next 2.5 days are for, to come up with build ideas, throw them in the trash, replace them with new ideas, and then ending up Vaal-lobbing my league start by trying something super experimental. Anyways, that's all I got for now. May Vaal-lobs have interesting results, and I will see you around.